The scripture reading today is quite long. It's from 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 17 through 40. It's on pages 373 and 374 in your pew Bibles, if you'd like to follow along. It begins at the bottom of page 373. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let them choose one for themselves, and let them cut into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but will not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. "O Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the 12 tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God." Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be back after being sick for so long. It was a really rough week there. So I had a chance to go with some of our young adults to Iowa Wild hockey game the other night, and that was a lot of fun. the young adults give me a really hard time because they're really, really passionate about sports. But for the most part, I really only have kind of a passing interest. I mean, it's Super Bowl Sunday today. I still haven't really picked my team. I care probably just as much about the commercials and especially about the party and the food as I do about whatever the outcome of the game is. But I admit there's something intriguing about the rivalry that we see and all the trash talking of sports fans. Something about the kind of passion that somehow sports seems to tap into. You know, fan, let us not forget, is short for fanatic. That's what that means. But I marvel sometimes that a person putting a ball through a goal of some kind can, in the right context, can raise other people's blood pressure. I've heard grandmothers swearing like truckers because of the outcome of a game. I've seen people riot because their team lost, or get in fistfights because one person assaulted the honor of another person's team and things got out of control. And this kind of fierce competition that people have is something that's genuinely surprising to me. It's baffling how the wrong ball through the wrong hole can ruin somebody's day. Or that people will root for a sports team from a local area just because their parents rooted for the sports team, even if they live thousands of miles away and know no one on that team at all, or no one who goes to that college. But this kind of behavior actually has something really in common with how ancient religious people saw the world. While Jewish people believed that there was only one true God who created the heavens and the earth and everything in it, most other religious people of the day of the surrounding areas believed in a pantheon of little g gods, who, like modern sports teams, represented certain peoples of certain geographical areas. And many wars that people fought with human means and human endeavors were things that were supposed to reflect kind of a cosmic war between the supremacy of one people's gods and another people's gods. And if one people conquered another, it was seen as proving that the gods of this people were weak and the gods of the other people were strong. And there were rivalries, bitter rivalries, way beyond anything that you see in the Super Bowl or we find in the Civil War game between the Hawkeye and the Cyclones here in Iowa. And a lot of people were Cubs fans. I remember when the World Series happened, especially Steve was pretty memorable. This team that hadn't won a game or hadn't won the whole shooting match of baseball for 68 years, and another team who hadn't was the Indians? I forget. I'm not really a sports fan. This other team, neither of these teams had won. One of them for over a century. You know, people had gone their whole life rooting for a team and never seen them go all the way. And Elijah lived in a time sort of like this, I think. A time when it was tough to be a fan of the one true God. There weren't a lot of people out in the stands trash talking for the Lord at that time. And just like the empty stands of a team that's kind of washed up and kind of on a long losing streak, a team that's almost forgotten about, the altar of God had fallen into disrepair and neglect. And the spiritual condition of God's people is reflective of the fact that Elijah had to go and build an altar for the Lord. He had to go and grab those 12 stones just so that the living God would have an altar in the land once again. And so Elijah comes on the scene as this kind of holy troublemaker, trash talking for the Lord all by his lonesome. Like a single solitary fan out there. There was a guy who made the news or something. He was like the only fan for this one team in this one city in this away game. And he was belligerent. He was out there. He was making a scene, you know, even while thousands of people were booing him and telling him to sit down and shut up and calm down. And so we see this sort of thing in Elijah. We see this guy who, even when the king and the queen and armies of these false prophets are cheering for the other side, Elijah comes out, unafraid to stand up, unafraid to come and stand before people and represent the Lord. And the prophets in those days, the job of a prophet is something that's kind of hard for us to have a box for. It's kind of a holy complainer. It's someone who who brings the complaints of the people to God and brings the complaints of God to the people. And this was a dark time, and God had a whole lot of things to complain about. And Elijah was courageous. He called these people to decision. He called the people to choose whether they would settle for false gods whose prophets told them what they wanted to hear, and who let them do as they please, aside from baking a cake and setting it before this pole on a hill for Asherah, or engaging in ritual prostitution to supposedly fertilize the land, or maybe a little bit of self-harm here or there. If they wanted to worship a God who was a living God, who demanded something of them, they had to actually sacrifice, not just do the things that they wanted to do. And God was a God who was asking them to walk in holiness, not just offer a token cake here or there. God wanted people who were set apart and obedient. And I believe in many ways that we live in a time that is a lot like the time of Elijah in many ways. Few people care enough about other people to call them to decision. Few people are willing to challenge those who walk in darkness or who teach false things, or think that as long as they just avoid certain horrible things and try to do no harm as they go through this life, that they can live a life apart from God, a stranger to God, and that's good enough for them. You know, we may disagree with Elijah's methods, but do we have a place in our lives where we're willing to say enough is enough? Where we're unwilling to compromise the truth just because it might make someone uncomfortable? A place where we're willing to say to someone that God might lead our way, how is your soul? Or do you know the Lord? You know, I don't think we need to rub it in as Elijah did with sarcasm, with mockery, you know. By asking people, how is serving yourself working out for you when they find that rock bottom, you know? But I think sometimes there is a place for that. There is a place for the prophetic in the church. There's a place to bring the complaints of God to the people. And there's a time when to be spiritually attentive is to call people to decision about where their lives are headed. There's a time to call people out for their waywardness. Not from a place of self-righteousness and legalism, but from a place of compassion and love. And Elijah did his trash talking and brought this challenge to the idolatry of his day with a purpose. He wanted to win the people's hearts back to God. And his words were deeply offensive. I mean, deeply offensive, irritating. They got under the skin of these false prophets. And if you understand a little bit about their theology, they were taught that because of this drought, Baal, keep in mind, was kind of a storm god, a god of rain, that their theology taught them that because of this drought that Elijah had caused with his prayer, that Baal, their false god, was somewhere in the underworld, captive, and that this was what caused the drought. And his suggestion that Baal was off on a trip somewhere or deep asleep was abidingly close to what these false prophets actually believed, and the thing that they were trying to ignore, that it was getting harder and harder to keep worshiping a storm god in years of drought. And the Hebrew here is quite difficult, and there's a lot of different versions of the Bible that have put it different ways, such as Baal was occupied, or Baal was deep in thought, or Baal had wandered away. But if you approach this as trash talking, and I think that really is the context of what Elijah is saying here, then the ESV, the translation of what Baal was relieving himself, was really the one that makes the most sense. People don't want to put that in the Bible. It's a little bit offensive. It's a little bit over the top. But that's probably what Elijah was hinting at. That Baal was unavailable because he was off having a bowel movement. And so Elijah was pulling no punches here. He was humiliating these false prophets. But he does this out of love for the people of God that they have led astray. He does it to show the powerlessness of Baal, the foolishness and the sickness of these people who believed that mutilating their bodies in a frenzy was a way of controlling their twisted God. And so I would challenge you to think sometimes that offense is needed. You know, we see this in the Bible. We see John the Baptist call people a brood of vipers. We see Paul call the Galatians, "You stupid Galatians." It's right there in the Bible. We see Jesus call people whitewashed tombs who were clean and proper on the outside, but inside were full of rotten, dead men's bones. I mean, what an offensive thing to say. Sometimes God wants people to be a bull in a china shop for him. And where apathy and corruption go unchallenged, only destruction will follow. The logical consequences of not challenging people's beliefs when they're wrong or twisted or evil is that they're just going to keep going that way. And it's not love that keeps us safe. It's actually being negligent. It's being afraid. And I think there's a bigger problem here that, do we ever expect that God will show up at all? Do we ever dare God to do something big? It's easy, I think, to make fun of people who worship the sun or the moon or a statue or a pole on a hill. But if we're not careful, we can recreate that same sort of functional atheism, a God of no accountability who demands nothing of us, who demands only that we eat fried chicken, watch a football game, and call it good. We can create a kind of cosmic yes man and put it in the place of God and substitute serving God with rules and rituals and sin management, or with slowly taking back control of every area of our life that God is asking for with one little tiny eviction notice at a time. It's kind of ironic to think about it, but if you say, "No, Lord," that is the greatest oxymoron ever. Because God can't be Lord if you're saying no, can he? Or we say like Jonah, "Absolutely not going there, God. Not to those people. I don't want to speak up here, God." 1 Thessalonians warns us about quenching the Spirit. And as many of you know who've been following me on Facebook, I've been dabbling with blacksmithing lately. I have built an anvil and a forge, and I've been pulling a hot piece of metal out of the fire and hitting it with a hammer and changing its shape. And this week was the first week that I actually got a quenching bucket and have played around with quenching hot iron and seeing what it does and understanding the science of what happens when you quench steel. And for the first time Friday, I literally quenched steel purposefully to change its nature, plunging a red-hot piece of steel into a bucket of water to change it into something stiffer and hard. And if steel is allowed to cool naturally, it just goes back to the way it was. But if you a state that's like relatively malleable, relatively soft and workable. But if you quench steel, it becomes hardened. And I made a tool that goes in my anvil that is springy, and you get that effect by taking something and kind of quenching it in and out and waiting and quenching it in and slowly stepping down this process of cooling and accelerating it until the outside of the steel is hard and the inside is still soft. And that's what makes that springiness that you have in steel. But if you were to hold that piece of hot iron in the bucket until it quenches all the way down all at once, it gets so hard and so brittle that if you hit it with a hammer or you try to bend it, it's just going to shatter. It's just going to break. And I think when God shows up, God shows up like that fire. God shows up as this force of change in our lives, a force that softens us so that God can transform us and set us apart for something of useful purpose in his kingdom. But when we say no to God's Spirit, each little no is like a little quench in the bucket that makes us a little bit less flexible, a little bit less able to move where God wants us to move without resistance, without springing back to the way that we were before, as soon as that tension lets go. And just like that piece of steel that's been quenched all the way, when we just give God that final no, absolutely not, and quench the Spirit like that with our whole body, with our whole self, it makes us so hard that when we try to move, we're just going to break in a spiritual life. And I think some of us have maybe been quenching the Spirit for a long time without even thinking about it. To the point where when God asks us to move again, we're just afraid that we're going to break. But a trip back into the fire can undo all of that. The way that it works is if you can relax all those hard places and soften them up again, And the Spirit can restructure our lives, just like the crystalline structure of that metal with its purifying heat. It can change us back to that place of being humble again, of being workable, of being willing to be transformed. And Elijah's life, after a lot of saying yes to God and walking closely with God for a long time, Elijah's life wasn't like a piece of iron. It was like a sail, soft and supple, able to catch the Spirit of God, able to use his strength in such a way that the Spirit would pull him along, pull around a whole ship even, to pull his people back after God. Elijah's life wasn't like all about Elijah. It was about the Lord. It was about being soft and malleable and flexible to the Spirit's call. And just like the individual strands of a sail, Elijah's whole life had been reshaped to be a vessel, ready to catch God's power and let it do the work through us that it wants to do. And that's the call that God has for all of us. He wants to change us. He wants to be at work in us. He wants us to make such a habit of saying yes to him that it softens us and softens us and makes us supple and smooth and useful. Being set apart for God's purposes means that we let go of trying to be the rudder. We let go of trying to manufacture the wind. We let go of saying to God, no, this part of my life, that's off limits. You know, the wind never stopped blowing. The Spirit never stopped being at work. But if we're honest, some of us have perhaps rolled up our sails a little bit and set ourselves adrift. Some of us maybe have dropped an anchor and said, no, I'm not going to move any further with you. Many of us have stopped arranging our lives around ways of letting God do the work, and we try to do all the work ourselves. And some of us, I think, just want a shortcut. We want to build the biggest Evinrude engine that you can imagine and strap it to the back of that boat, and fire it up, and take control and drive that boat anywhere we want it to go. So we don't need the wind of the Spirit to pull us along, so that we can keep control of things, so that we can take our lives where we want instead of emptying ourselves and submitting to God and letting him soften us and smooth away the rough places. But God doesn't want to settle for half of our heart. He won't settle for us saying, God, confrontation, you know, that thing that makes us really uncomfortable, that's completely off the table. And all those people out there wondering if God is real, they can just go on their merry way because I don't want things to get socially awkward. Those people out there prostituting their bodies to the veils of this world or cutting themselves, hoping for the rains to come in our time, however that looks for us, or who believe toxic things, destructive things that no one in their life is willing to challenge. They're on their own because our whole culture, our whole society has a bunch of empty stands on the Jesus side right now, and I don't want to be that one out, that one voice out there who stands for God. I just want to walk away. You know, I agree that the church looks pretty torn these days. It looks pretty weak. It looks pretty crumbly. It looks like our society has stopped building an altar for God and started building altars for all these other things, all these false hopes and false dreams. In the public spaces, the altar of God in our society, this esteem that we might have for God has been shrinking year after year after year. But perhaps it's because the Church of America has grown a bit inflexible, a bit apprehensive, a bit unwilling to expect that God will show up if we act in faithfulness. Maybe we've become a bit too timid about daring God to do big things. But in the midst of so many people falling away from God, the heart of God has not changed. He still wants to win back the hearts of his people. He still wants us to be willing to be responsive, to be willing to tell the truth when the world only wants to hear silence or lies. And God still uses those people who are willing to make big risks to help call people to decision. Those who are willing to challenge the waywardness and apathy and fear of our world. And God still uses those who will do their part so that others can see that the false emperors in their life really have no clothes. God still uses people who are willing to unmask the lies of this world so that others may see clearly, who pray like Elijah, Lord, let it be known today that you are God in Israel. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. You know, can we be bold enough to pray something like that? to truly desire to hear people say again, the Lord is God. Maybe for the first time. Maybe for the first time in a long time. To say that, to believe that, to have that moment where they see that the Lord is God. The Lord is God. And I believe that if we're willing to go there, God is willing to back us up. His Spirit is willing. And the question really is, are we willing? And if not, what's holding us back? And what are we going to do about it? Because the Spirit's still blowing. The force of God has never stopped moving. The only thing that's stopped moving is us. So as we go into this time of open worship, a time of waiting for God's Spirit to speak to you, it's a time of listening together for God. If you feel that God has a message that He might speak through, you feel free to stand and share that message. Sometimes we just wait in silence and God just has a message that's just for us. And sometimes God has a message that might come through you for our whole body. And so whatever happens, don't miss that listening time, of listening for God's Spirit, of opening up the sail of your spirit, letting God fill you, pull you the way that He wants you to go. So we'll just take a moment of